constant. And it's sort of unprecedented in scope. There have been works by Bach, for example, where you can find remarkable degrees of dissonance, but usually those are vocal works. For example, you might have a cantata. Thinking of any number of cantatas where this comes to mind, but Cantata 71 has some wonderful dissonance in it. Cantata 76, which is Die Himmel erzählen die Ehre Gottes, the heavens are telling the glory of God, has dissonance in it. There's a famous tenor aria in one of the cantatas that's all about hatred. Hatred of what? Hatred of the enemy. There are famous arias that meditate on sinfulness, the depravity of the human soul. So you can have dissonance if you're singing about how horrible humans are, because the fall of Adam, in the garden, and durch Adams Fall ist ganz verderbt, through the fall of Adam, all mankind became corrupted, and according to the pietist Lutheran mentality, we're all just these corrupt, malfeasant, degenerate, rotting people, and I mean rotten and rotting, and you're just hoping for some kind of eschatological paradise if you're blessed with the gift of grace and salvation, but otherwise you're going to burn in hellfire, and you're going to go to a lake of fire for the rest of eternity. So you can have very dissonant music in a setting like that, right? But it would be unusual to find it in a keyboard piece. But Beethoven's doing it here. Let me give you another example. Here's one from the famous Moonlight Sonata, which someone else mentioned. The Moonlight Sonata is an interesting piece. Beethoven himself was aware of how popular it was during his own lifetime. One of his publishers, Artaria, said Beethoven, I got good news for you, I got a check for you here. The Moonlight Sonata, selling like hotcakes. People love it. And Beethoven's response, and I'm paraphrasing here, as you could probably tell, Beethoven's response was something like, "Don't those idiots know I've written better stuff than that?" Well, it starts with this very ominous and moody kind of gesture in the right hand and a descending bass line. So we start at C sharp and then to and to now this very simple melody comes in. A little cross rhythm. Snaps his finger and E minor. Really far away from where we started. Watch this. Minor, major. Those last four bars. Here's B major. Well, you want him to resolve it, but before he does this. So what he does is he takes this tone, the B, and he surrounds it. Here's C, here's A sharp. Chromatic neighbors, both on either side. Think of a piano, they're exactly on either side of the operative note. What it does, practically, is it intensifies that cathartic feeling that we all experience as listeners when the notes resolve. So Beethoven's approach to harmony is unprecedented, and I would suggest that dissonance is a big part of that equation. There's more to it. I could get into the musical gobbledygook of chromatic median modulations, and I'm sure that everyone here who's interested in music theory, all three of us, would be charmed by that discussion. But we're going to move on now, and I want to share some personal anecdotes about Beethoven's life leading up to 1824. 200 years ago was May 8th, 1824, when the Ninth Symphony premiered. So there's never a bad time to study Beethoven, but this, my friends, is a particularly auspicious time to study Beethoven, as we're now almost exactly 200 years from the premiere. But first, a couple of anecdotes. Beethoven, as many of you know, died a bachelor. He never married. Unlike, for example, Aaron Copland or Samuel Barber or Leonard Bernstein or George Frederick Handel or Franz Peter Schubert, Beethoven was not a gay man. It is reasonable sometimes when we look at history to see a composer who never gets married and never has children, and to suspect that perhaps they were not inclined towards the opposite sex. But in Beethoven's case, he loved women. However, he had a habit of proposing to women who were decidedly unavailable. This would mean daughters of the aristocracy, wives of friends, I mean, you name it. Beethoven fell in love with the wrong people. But, for example, the Moonlight Sonata was dedicated to the daughter of a count. He was an Italian aristocrat who served as a kind of a diplomat ambassador type in Vienna. And his name was Count Guicciardi, and his daughter, Giulietta, was one of Beethoven's pupils. She was probably about 17 or 18, and he in his late 20s when they met, and he proposed to her, irrespective of how she felt about him. Marrying him was out of the question, because she was the daughter of a count, and he was Ludwig van Beethoven, not von Beethoven. Of course, in German nomenclature, VON implies Bürger status, somebody who's of the land-owning class. Beethoven was not VON Beethoven, he was VAN Beethoven. Van, VAN, simply indicated that he was of Dutch ancestry. Of course, not everyone in Vienna knew that, and Beethoven would play that up to his advantage. In other words, if people thought he was an aristocrat, he did not disabuse them of that illusion. But of course, when it came to a marriage proposal or something like of that nature, they would have done their research and they would have known. And Beethoven was no aristocrat. So, well, why do we even know about the Countess Giulietta? And the answer is because Beethoven dedicated the Moonlight Sonata to her. And if you look at the sheet music, it says gewidmet. Love that word. German is such a beautiful language, isn't it? If you look at the dedication page, it says dedicated to the Countess Giulietta Guicciardi. So her name is written in at least the footnotes of the Beethoven biographies, and for that reason she'll be someone that anyone who reads Beethoven's biographies or anyone who has read his sheet music at the piano will see it printed there on the title page. So Beethoven never had children, but he did fall in love with several women, and it never worked out. Some of you may know that the most mysterious Beethoven romance had to do with a woman who we basically know who she is, or who she was rather. Probably her name was Antonia Brentano, but she is known in German as the Unsterbliche Geliebte, or the Immortal Beloved. Some of you may have seen that movie with Gary Oldman from 1994, where Gary Oldman plays Beethoven. What I'll say about that movie before we move on is that, well, it's no Amadeus, but it's better than other Beethoven biopics. There are some Beethoven biopics which are utter abominations. Beethoven's Copyist with Ed Harris is one such movie, not because of Ed Harris. He's great. Diane Kruger's great in the movie. The acting's fine. It's just the writing is so atrocious. You wonder, like, Ed Harris must just have wanted to play Beethoven. I don't care how bad the script is, just I want to be Beethoven. But Immortal Beloved is a decent movie, but I think for most of us who love history and who love music, we look to the gold standard of musical biopics, and that's Amadeus, right? The adaptation of Peter Shaffer's play by Milos Forman in 1984. And nothing compares to it, unfortunately. I don't know why nobody's made a Beethoven movie. I understand that the last 10 years of his life would just be him, like, deaf and just shouting, "What?" But there's great stuff in the Beethoven biography. Anyway, all right. One more story about Beethoven, and then we'll move on to the story of the Ninth Symphony. As you can probably tell from his music, from the examples I just discussed and played at the piano, Beethoven's music suggests that he himself, as an individual, even though he was fully integrated into the highest echelons of society, Beethoven hobnobbed with the highest level aristocrats. At one point, he was giving the youngest brother of the Emperor of Austria, composition lessons, much to Beethoven's chagrin, because the lessons were like 3 hours long, and Beethoven felt it took away from his own composition time. But nonetheless, that individual's name, by the way, was the Archduke Rudolph. And there are any number of Beethoven works gewidmet, dedicated to Archduke Rudolph. But here's a great story that tells us that Beethoven, and you see this in the music, even though he was fully integrated into society as a composer, he was brought into the highest echelons of that aristocratic society. Beethoven did not care much for the institution of the aristocracy. He was really a sort of a, Napoleon, in the early days of the French Revolution. He was horrified by the reign of terror and Robespierre, but he was very inspired by the rise of Napoleon in the mid-1790s. And he would have considered himself a sort of, in the style of 1790s Napoleon, small r Republican. He would have considered himself someone who, like those who grew up in the 1770s and 80s, were influenced by the principles of the Aufklärung, of the Enlightenment. Beethoven knew, for example, members of the Illuminati, members of the Freemasons. Mozart himself was a Freemason. Franz Joseph Haydn became a Freemason. Beethoven never did, but he knew of these societies, and he embraced their ideals of a meritocratic society. It's interesting that meritocracy is very much in discussion these days in modern politics, because Beethoven was very much of the opinion that if you were good at something, and you were really good at it, then society would reward you in a way that was commensurate with your talent and contributions. And for that reason, he hated the institution of the aristocracy, because he saw people who were upjumped merely by the coincidence of their birth. And there's a wonderful story that testifies to this, and I'll tell it and then we'll move on to the Ninth Symphony. In 1806, Beethoven had long been supported by a particular aristocrat whose name was Karl von Lichnowsky. Actually, Lichnowsky was a dedicatee of many Beethoven works, including the Pathetique Sonata, which I played for you just a couple of moments ago. Lichnowsky was, of course, a Viennese aristocrat, which meant he knew aristocrats from various social circles in other countries. That included French aristocrats. Now, at this particular moment in time, the Napoleonic Wars were in full swing, and the French Grande Armée was undefeated in the field and had relatively easily subdued Viennese, or the Austrian opposition, occupied Vienna. And Beethoven began to really hate the French during this period. Many of you know that his third symphony, the E-flat symphony, was initially called the Bonaparte Symphony. It was to be dedicated to Napoleon. Once Napoleon slapped a crown on his head and declared himself emperor, Beethoven angrily crossed out the dedication and instead wrote the dedication title that, not the dedication, but the title that we know today, which the Third Symphony is known by. Third Symphony is known as the Eroica, the Heroic Symphony. And it's not a coincidence that the second movement of that symphony is a funeral march. That was written after he scratched out the initial title page. So Beethoven was long supported by Prince Lichnowsky, and Lichnowsky kept any number of musicians in his household. The way that aristocrats back then, if you needed to have someone fix your shirts, well, you had tailors who you could go to. If your shoes were messed up, you'd go to a cobbler, and you'd have them in your household retinue. These were people that could be summoned and were there sort of on retainer, as it were, to help you with whatever you needed. If you needed help with your wagon wheels, you had a Wainwright to work on that. If your horse needed a shoe, you had a blacksmith to work on that. And musicians were considered servants in that same way. Mozart chafed at this idea in 1781 when he arrived in Vienna to attend the coronation of Emperor Joseph II. He wrote to his father about how angry he was that he was seated at a feast at the same table with the stable hands. Beethoven would chafe at that system too, for the same reason. Mozart looked around and said, I write sublime music and these guys muck out stables. An important job, but not the same as writing symphonies. And Beethoven also chafed against this institution. And so often Beethoven would be invited to dinner, and his job was to play for the high-ranking members of the nobility who would attend Lichnowsky's dinner parties. On this particular occasion, because Vienna was occupied by the French Grande Armée, there were any number of French aristocratic army officers who were known to Lichnowsky and who were invited over to dinner. Now you can imagine how Beethoven felt about this. combustible atmosphere. He hates the French, he hates the aristocrats, even though he relies on them to pay the bills. And here they all are under one roof, and Beethoven is being asked to entertain. Well, after they had dinner, Lichnowsky summoned Beethoven and he said, "Spiel etwas für uns," play something for us. And Beethoven answered with a single word, "Nein." No. Lichnowsky asks again, Beethoven once again refuses. Lichnowsky says, "I don't think you heard me, Beethoven." Beethoven responds, "I don't think you heard me." Now this is 1806 in Vienna. Well, Lichnowsky says, "You know, Beethoven, I think I need to remind you who I am." Beethoven interrupts him and says, "Oh, I know who you are. You're a prince. And there have been 1,000 princes before you, and there will be 1,000 princes after you, but there's only one Beethoven." Very well-known story. Very well-known story about Beethoven. Of course, he lost this very significant stipend of some $600 a year, which was a very significant sum to him. But for him, it was worth it. So you see, I tell this story to forge a connection between the music that we listen to, that dissonant, in-your-face style, and the attitude of the man who was writing it. In other words, it's sometimes said that Beethoven didn't care what people thought of his music. That's not true at all. He wanted people to like his music. He really did. You read, John Swafford's biography, which is a very detailed biography. I bet the library has it. It's called Beethoven, Anguish and Triumph, something like that. Very good. It was published a couple of years ago. And obviously there's a treasure trove of great biographies on Beethoven. When I was a graduate student, the go-to reading was Lewis Lockwood's biography. But if you want to read a great Beethoven biography, check out Jan Swafford. Jan Swafford, Swafford. And the book is called Anguish and Triumph. Wonderful book about Beethoven. Just prepare yourself because it's rather long. Like Rise and Fall of the Third Reich long. But like William Shirer's masterpiece, it reads very quickly. So this takes us to the road to the Ninth Symphony, which again premiered nearly exactly 200 years ago at the Kärntner Tortheater. That's one word in German, by the way. Kärntner Tortheater, which would mean Corinthian Gate Theater, which was not the biggest theater in Vienna. Beethoven had picked this theater because they had an in-house orchestra that Beethoven wanted to be led by his friend Ignaz Schuppanzig, who was a professional violinist, founded one of the first professional string quartets. Schuppanzig was a rather rotund individual, rather corpulent. Beethoven's name for him was Falstaff. And he wanted Falstaff to lead the orchestra. And at the big theater in town, which is the Theater an der Wien, the theater on the Vienna, here the Vienna River, the tributary of the Danube, they had their own in-house orchestra, and they said, "No, Beethoven, you can't have Falstaff lead the orchestra." Now this is significant, because what it meant was the Ninth Symphony was played by a smallish orchestra which had to be augmented by additional performing forces. So they brought in, about half the orchestra was comprised of members of a group in Vienna, which was in its inchoate stage at this point, would become a very important group in the 19th century. They were known as the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde. Hey, that's more genitive case. Gesellschaft, the society, der Musikfreunde, society of the friends of music. Actually, when I was first at Naugatuck Valley and we started a separate account with our foundation, because we would get donations, and I started doing a little bit of fundraising. We have a musical theater troupe that raises thousands of dollars every summer through touring. So I said, we better have our own money so we can do with it what we want. And I called it the Friends of NBCC Music, and I modeled that after Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde. I could have called it Gesellschaft der NBCC Musikfreunde. That probably would have confused donors. Who do I write the check to? Now, Beethoven was totally deaf at this point in his life. He had had a rather fallow period in the late 18 teens and into the early 1820s. A lot of that had to do with his deteriorating health. Again, we talked about not just the deafness, but earaches, the tooth infections, the dropsy or edema that had to be treated with the barber surgeon, shall we say. And obviously, the fact that he could no longer function socially. He had, the one silver lining for historians is that he had these books called Tagesgesprächbücher. That's one word. Tages, daily, Gespräch, conversation, Bücher, books. Tagesgesprächbücher. And so because of these, we actually know a lot about what Beethoven was thinking on any given day. Because what would happen is he would speak, and anyone who was talking to him would write the question they had for him, the comment in the Tagesgesprächbücher. So Beethoven retained the power of speech until his death. Obviously, he was not born deaf, but he couldn't converse, so people would have to write what they were thinking for him to fully understand them. Now you'd say, why does that matter? The answer is because for musicologists, this is a treasure trove. You know, some of it, of course, is very mundane and banal, like on, Tuesday, April 16th, 1824, he had Kartoffelsalat for lunch, he had potato salad for lunch. Like some of it's very, very boring, but much of it is very insightful. Therefore, the fact that he was in this sort of down period in his life, it makes it more and more interesting that he comes roaring back with, I would suggest, at least 3 works that really cement his legacy as the greatest living composer of that time. Now, he was not the most popular composer in the 1820s. That title actually goes to, believe it or not, Rossini. Rossini was considered the most popular composer, at least in Vienna. And Beethoven, to his credit, was not resentful of this, although he did say some disparaging things about Rossini. And we can understand why. Rossini's music to Beethoven was not serious. The 3 works that I would point to that really solidified Beethoven's legacy would be 3 works in different genres. His last piano sonata, the Opus 111 Sonata. I'm not going to say much about it now. We'll leave that as a desideratum for the future. But it is a wonderful, very forward-looking piece. There are parts of that sonata that seem to anticipate music that wouldn't be written for 100 years. I'm not exaggerating. It's really the second movement. Listen to the second movement of the Opus 111. Close your eyes and imagine you didn't know it was Beethoven, and then try to guess who wrote it. And if you came up with a figure from 100 years later, you wouldn't be off. Then in the realm of sacred music, the Missa Solemnis, a wonderful setting of the Mass Ordinary. Mass Ordinary here means the Mass that would be, the text that it belongs to the Mass that would be said every day, that's part of the Eucharistic sacrament. That would include the Kyrie, which is in Greek, the Gloria, the very long middle section, which is known as the Credo, and then the Sanctus, the Holy, 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 and then finally the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, qui tollis peccata mundi, who takes away the sins of the world. Now, we don't think of Beethoven as a religious guy. In fact, he was not an atheist. Sometimes that's suggested. Beethoven was almost certainly a deist. Like many thinkers of the Enlightenment period, he thought that there was a God, but it was a distant and loving God. But a God who granted full autonomy to we puny mortals. You can see this text in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which we'll get to. So he set the Mass in the Missa Solemnis, and that is, Beethoven certainly considered it his greatest work. I don't think most people think of it that way today, but it is a towering work, not one that's done very often because it's very long and very difficult, very hard for the singers. If you're a singer and you've sung in a community choir or something like that, you may have sung for decades and you've never sung the Missa Solemnis because you'd have to have either a really ambitious, really crazy, or really sort of narcissistic, egomaniac director who would program it. When I say narcissistic, I mean someone who knows that it's not going to come together but just wants to do it anyway. There are plenty of choir directors who do that. As a choir director myself, I know all the inside tea on choir directors. One of my favorite classes that I teach at a college is that, as you heard Elaine read, I direct the choir. There's plenty of Beethoven we would sing, but guess what? The Missa Solemnis is not on my list. There's a moment in the Credo where the sopranos have to go up to an A in the 5th octave and just like hold it for 20 measures in a row. So anyway, it is done, you'd see it done, for example, for those of you who go up to Tanglewood, you might hear it done in a venue like that, or if the BSO is doing a big Beethoven celebration, then you might hear them do it there, and they'll bring in a big choir, but it's not a work that's done very often. The Ninth Symphony is sort of the ultimate feather in the cap, the ultimate crown in the Beethovenian, the ultimate jewel in the Beethovenian crown. So what makes it so special? I would suggest that the Beethoven ideas of cyclical unity come to a real apotheosis here. What do I mean by cyclical unity? Let me give you an example. In the Fifth Symphony, Beethoven had introduced the idea that you could have a theme that is not limited to its respective movement. Now, we know that symphonies are multi-movement works, right? So you can have a theme that starts like this, right? With that short, long rhythm. And then you can have a movement, 2 movements later, in the scherzo where you have and then right, do you know the third movement? that, there's that, it's the same rhythm as, it's the same thing in the second movement, right? So this idea that you can have a single theme that re-emerges in different movements was unusual, really unprecedented. Beethoven does that here. The first movement starts with this very sort of enigmatic gesture. It's not a melody or it's not even a harmony. It's just a gestural sort of figuration that appears in the strings. That sort of thing. Let's listen to it. This is going to be significant. Here's Andrei Roscoe Estrada conducting the Frankfurt Radio Symphony Orchestra, or it's called in German the Rundfunksorchester. Okay. You hear that? It sounds like they're tuning up almost.
Yeah.
Open intervals, just A and E, fourths and fifths. The audience in the Kärntner Tor Theater, the Corinthian Gate Theater in Vienna, must have been perplexed seeing the chorus sitting back there, wondering what the heck's the chorus doing here. Symphonies aren't supposed to have choruses in them. We'll get to that. The second movement is a rolling scherzo, molto vivace, so fast that you really can't count the beats. You'd have to just count the measures instead. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Imagine trying to conduct the beats there. You wouldn't do it. There's not a conductor in the world who would conduct the individual beats. It's almost felt, we would say, it's felt in one. Let's listen a little bit to that. Here it's imitative, contrapuntal. Give the bassoonist a little spotlight there. So, yamparam, yamparam, with these big timpani strikes, and the opening gesture, yamparam, those octaves evoke the opening of the first movement, so a little bit of unity there. But the scherzo is misplaced here in the symphony. Typically, the order of the four movements of the symphony goes fast, slow, minuet, fast. Here we go fast, with a mysterious slow opening, then really fast, molto vivace is the designation Beethoven puts in the tempo. And then the third movement is our breather. It's the respite after all this stormy music. By the way, I'm only playing very short clips. These movements are colossal in scope by the standards of the classical period. There are entire symphonies by Haydn and Mozart that could be swallowed up in a single movement of Beethoven's Ninth. In fact, the finale of Beethoven's Ninth is about 22 to 24 minutes in most performances. That's longer than most Haydn symphonies. Just one movement. We go a little bit to we're going to listen just a little bit to the third movement, which is this beautiful adagio. Beethoven's gift for writing slow music reaches an unprecedented level here at the end of his life. And you can see this not only in the Adagio from the Ninth Symphony, but also in some of the famous string quartets of that last phase of his life. For example, if you listen to the Cavatina from the Opus 130 string quartet, that music, by the way, is floating out on the Voyager probe, which is like 14 billion miles away right now. Sounds far, but as many of you know, that's like leaving your driveway as far as getting to the next star system. But when Carl Sagan was putting together that golden record that was going to feature if some alien race intercepts that probe and can decipher that phonograph, and they want to see what is human civilization created, one of the things they'll encounter is a slow movement from a Beethoven string quartet, the Cavatina from the Opus 130, the B-flat major sonata, quartet rather. Also the famous Opus 132 middle movement, what's called the, let's see if I can remember it, die heilige Dankgesang geschrieben auf dem lyddischen Tonart an die Gottheit, which means the holy song of thanksgiving written in the Lydian mode dedicated to the deity, which is very wonderful. You know, Google it, Opus 132. If you go to YouTube and type Opus 132, it's the first thing that will come up. It'll say Opus 132 and it'll autofill middle movements. I love when it does that. Good to, for people who are looking, where do I look, where do I, you know, Google's your friend sometimes when it can autofill what you're, maybe you have some of the details but not everything. All right, now we come to the finale. The finale begins, we're not going to obviously be able to listen to any meaningful amount of this. It's a huge symphony, and it's beyond the scope of what we have time to cover in a single program. But I'll say a few things about it. Beethoven begins the symphony finale with a chord that historians have termed the terror chord. Why is that? Well, it's just D minor, second inversion. At the very same time, B flat major. What does that sound like together? And then the cellos and basses. So what we get is this strikingly dissonant chord. We know about that. We're experts on this idea, right? And then they're interrupted by the cellos and basses. But the cellos and basses are not playing in strict time. It doesn't have the regular periodicity that we expect in the beginning of a movement. Instead, it feels very free. Almost like a kind of style we would encounter, of all places, in the realm of opera. Does anybody know what form I'm alluding to here in opera that we encounter, where there's a very free approach to rhythm, not a strict periodicity, but rather a sort of sung style which has elements of spoken speech, but also is harmonized with chords. Anyone know what that's called? Starts with an R? Recitative. Very good, yes. Beethoven actually writes in the score for the cello and basses, quasi un recitativo. Play it like a recitative. Now, why is he writing that? Why does he say to the cellos and basses, play this melody sort of freely in time as if it were a recitative? That's going to be significant as we listen. Let's just listen to the first few moments. Sound familiar? First movement. Same music, right? Different key, same music. Interrupted. There's our recitative. Scherzo, second movement, molto vivace. Interrupted. Now, what do you think is coming next? Third movement. Warm adagio, lyrical, haunting. Interrupted. Da 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 da. Exactly the conventional way recitative ends. Now, what's Beethoven doing here? Well, to answer that question, we must consider why a composer writes recitatives in an opera, for example. And the answer is the recitative is when characters want to say something. The arias are not for them to express thoughts so much as to reflect on emotions. When you watch an opera, the recitative is where the plot comes out. It's where the characters are trying to articulate a thought or idea. The arias are just meditations on those ideas. The arias are what most people are interested in. Most people are not interested in recitative. I happen to write my dissertation on recitative. So I'm a big fan of recitative, specifically in the Bach Passion oratorios. For those who know the St. John and St. Matthew Passions, that was a focus of my research when I was a graduate student. But Beethoven here does something interesting. He gives the cellos and basses recitative, which suggests that the cellos and basses are trying to say something. Yet every time they get going, what happens? They are interrupted by the orchestra. And they're not interrupted with new thematic material, but rather with recycled material. Maybe that's an uncharitable word, but with music that manifests once again as if a ghost from the past. First, the open fifths and fourths, that hollow, enigmatic sound of the first movement. Then the blazing molto vivace scherzo of the second movement, and finally the adagio cantabile of the third movement. And every time the orchestra goes, the basses and cello come right back in, and they say, no, 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 no. Here we're still trying to talk. Finally, they reach a moment, and you'll hear it's right where we stopped. They're going to try to articulate the Freude theme, the joy theme. Hear it? We got a little echo of it. But going to be interrupted again. This back and forth goes on for the first 6.5 minutes of the movement. And finally, the terror chord returns. I'm not going to play it again. I think we all heard it loud and clear when I played. You heard it when the brass are blaring it here. And we as the listener are wondering what on earth is going on here. It's as if there's this battle taking place between opposing forces within the orchestra. There's something like a voice that's trying to emerge, and yet every time it does, it's interrupted. And then there's this crashing dissonant chord that seems to reset everything. So what's left? How are we going to resolve this stalemate? What about this message that we think the cellos and basses are trying to articulate? They can't get it up because they're insufficient somehow. They lack something. What do they lack? The inimitable, unparalleled, unrivaled expressivity of God's instrument itself, the human voice. And so what happens? A baritone comes in. And what does he say? Oh, Freunde, oh, friends, nicht diese Töne. Not these tones. In other words, not all that stuff from the first, second, and third movements. Leave that stuff in die Vergangenheit, leave it in the past. Sondern, however, the adversative German conjunction meaning but, or rather, however, lass uns angenehmer anstimmen. Let us raise our voices in a more joyful sound. And this, of course, leads to the explosion of the Freude theme. But what precedes that is very interesting. So I'm going to fast forward to that moment. You can see it here. There's a wonderful moment where the... All right, here it is. Cue the baritone. Oh, friends. Not not these tones, not what you're playing, sondern
lass uns
pause it there. Now that theme is going to be subjected to what we might think of as a set of variations. It's going to manifest in all sorts of ways, reaching a real zenith about 10 minutes from this moment, where the choir sings in a double fugue in 6/8 time, the Freude theme against a counter subject. It is a tour de force of counterpoint and shows that even though his style most of the time couldn't be more different than Bach's, Beethoven had really absorbed the elements of fugue writing and really knew how to write contrapuntal polyphonic music. Now obviously we don't have time to listen to the whole thing, so what we're going to do to end is I want to meditate for a moment on this poem. Beethoven had been thinking about this poem and specifically about setting it to music for 4 decades. He had encountered it in his youth in the city of Bonn in West Germany, where he grew up. When I say West Germany, we understand there is no Germany until 1871, but he grew up in Bonn, in what's now Western Germany, on the Rhine River, and Beethoven had encountered this particular poem, which was written by a poet. Anyone know who wrote it? Friedrich Schiller, excellent. Now, he only sets part of the poem. It's a very long poem, but the poem not only reflects elements of the Aufklärung, of the Enlightenment, but also, I think, it reflects convictions that Beethoven held near and dear. And because our goal tonight is not only to understand Beethoven's musical language and to understand a bit of his biography, we want to understand his ethos as clearly as we can understand it. And this symphony gives us a wonderful window into his ethos. The words here. Freude, schöne Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium. Joy, daughter of the divine spark itself, the daughter of Elysium. Wir betreten Feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum. We enter Feuertrunken, drunk with fire, sort of pagan language there, right? Drunk with fire, himmlische dein Heiligtum, into your heavenly abode. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt. Your magic binds together that which custom has divided. Alle Menschen werden, Bruder, wo dein sanfter Flug weilt. All men, this is we understand this to mean all humanity, werden, Bruder, become brothers wherever your heavenly wing flutters. It is not a coincidence, my friends, that when the Berlin Wall fell in late 1989, that the music that was chosen to symbolize that monumental moment, which I think many of us in this room, certainly I was 5 years old, but even just reading about it, I get goosebumps, reading about what it did for people, how people reacted to this event. And what was the musical selection that was chosen to represent this unification, not only of East and West Germany, but really what was thought to heal the wounds that had been festering since the start of the First World War in 1914, right? What was it? It was Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. A work written by a German composer, but conducted by an American Jewish conductor and composer from Lawrence, Massachusetts, by way of New York City, a guy by the name of Leonard Bernstein, who, by the way, was nearly 72 years old at the time, in late 1989. Leonard Bernstein was born in 1918, and he was very, very sick. And yet he went over there, and everyone who saw him during this trip remarked upon this vigor, this renewed energy he had as he conducted his performance of the United Orchestras of East and West Germany with soloists and a large choir singing the words of Friedrich Schiller with one change. Ode to Joy, an die Freude, became an die Freiheit, the ode to freedom. And this is kind of a symbol of how Beethoven's music, usually musicologists would say don't change anything about a piece. This is a big no-no. Yes, I know the Met does a wonderful, condensed magic flute in English, and I've seen it and I love it, but generally speaking, we don't do this. And yet, it seemed wholly appropriate, I think, at the time, to everyone who heard it. The Ode to Joy, the Ode to Freedom, it is a sort of a representation, a reflection of the transcendent nature of Beethoven's music, and more broadly, the ability of music to unite. And so that was, I would say, a pivotal moment in the history of 20th century music. For Beethoven, it tells us a lot about his ethos, because Beethoven has a reputation, my friends, as being a curmudgeon, a misanthrope, a rather surly, unpleasant individual. And there may be merit to those arguments. You can again read the Beethoven biographies and you'll see there is merit to those arguments. But I think ultimately, if we borrow deep down, we'll see that Beethoven, on some level, was a tried and true humanist, somebody who believed in the beauty of humanity and the ability of humanity to create beautiful art that did something to the human spirit. And the Ninth Symphony is but one example, probably the most famous example of that, but the fact that Beethoven had been meditating on the Schiller poem and how to set it to music, and then it finally makes its way into his music a decade or more after he completely loses his hearing. It tells us a lot about Beethoven the man, that even though he had every reason to be angry at the world, angry at God, angry at his circumstances, his surroundings, one of the most notable lines in the poem is, in the middle section, there's a line where it says, Sei umschlungen Millionen, diesen Kuss der ganzen Welt. Be embraced, you millions, this kiss is for the whole world. And then it says, Über Sternen muss ein lieber Vater wohnen. Above the canopy of stars, there must be a loving father dwelling there. And for everything that Beethoven endured and which he forced others to endure in his life, maybe this is the ultimate olive branch to humanity. This is Ninth Symphony. So thank you all for coming out to tonight's lecture.